Number 1, the Chimú child sacrifice field, Huanchaco, Peru. Modern Huanchaco is a surf town, beach bars, tourist hostels, reed fishing boats bobbing in the Pacific. It sits on the northern coast of Peru, a few miles from the ruins of Chanchan, the largest pre-Columbian adobe city ever built. Chanchan was the capital of the Chimú Empire, which between roughly 900 and 1470 AD controlled a 600-mile stretch of coastline along the Pacific. Their economy ran on irrigation agriculture, fishing, and textile production. All three were vulnerable to one thing: the weather. In 2011, a group of local children came home from playing in the sand dunes, carrying human bones. Their father called Gabriel Prieto, an archaeologist at the Universidad Nacional de Trujillo, who happened to be excavating a 3,500-year-old temple just down the road. Prieto dropped everything. What he found over the next 5 years working alongside John Verano, a biological anthropologist from Tulane University, would turn out to be the largest single mass child sacrifice event ever documented in the Americas, and possibly in the world. The site is called Huanchaquito Las Llamas. It covers about 7,500 square feet on a windswept bluff, roughly 1,000 feet from the ocean. Buried in the sand were the remains of more than 140 children, aged 5 to 14, alongside more than 200 juvenile llamas. Radiocarbon dating placed the event at around 1400 to 1450 AD, the height of Chimú power. The forensic detail is precise. Consistent transverse cuts across the sternum, displaced ribs forced outward. The chests of these children were sliced open and pulled apart, almost certainly for the removal of their still beating hearts. There were no false start cuts, no hesitation marks. Whoever did this had done it before. The llamas received the same treatment. Many of the children had their faces painted with red cinnabar pigment before they died. Some wore cotton headdresses. After death, their bodies were arranged in groups of 3, sorted by age, placed on their backs or sides with the legs flexed, facing northwest toward the ocean. The llamas were positioned facing east toward the Andes, a formal geometry, a ritual architecture of death. Preserved in a dried mud layer beneath the burials were footprints, sandaled adults, barefoot children, leashed llamas, all converging from the north and south edges of the bluff toward the center of the site. Deep skid marks in the mud show where reluctant animals were dragged. This was a procession. DNA analysis confirmed that both boys and girls were among the dead. Cranial modification styles and stable isotope ratios showed that the children came from multiple ethnic groups and regions across the Chimú Empire's vast territory. They were not drawn from a single village. This was coordinated at the state level. 3 adults were found in direct association with the burials. 2 women, both showing blunt force trauma to the head. 1 man. The women may have been caretakers, the man may have been the executioner. Sarah Jwingst, a bioarchaeologist at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, put it simply. This is unprecedented. I have been working in South America for 10 years, and I have never heard of anything like this before. And it did not stop. Subsequent excavations at the nearby site of Pampa La Cruz found 76 more child victims in 2022. Same chest incisions. The combined total across the Huanchaco area now exceeds 250 sacrificed children. Verano said, "Every place we put a shovel in, we find a child sacrifice." Why? A thick mud layer overlaying the burial sediments provides evidence of a catastrophic El Niño flood immediately before the sacrifice took place. The mainstream interpretation is that this was a state-directed response to environmental catastrophe, the most precious offering the Chimú could conceive of. Some researchers argue the motivation was more specific. Chimú children occupied a liminal status between human and divine, and their sacrifice was cosmologically precise, not a generic act of desperation. A third possibility is darker still. The sacrifice may not have been about the weather at all. The Inca were closing in. The children drawn from subjugated populations across the empire may have been hostages killed to terrorize vassal states into loyalty during a period of existential political threat. The Chimú fell to the Inca around 1470. Within 60 years, the Inca fell to Spain. Both conquests erased the Chimú's religious practices from memory. No colonial-era Spanish chronicle describes this ritual. The bones lay beneath a modern surf town for 5.5 centuries. meters from residential homes where locals had been finding fragments for years and dismissing them as old cemetery remains. But the Chimú were not the first civilization to bury people in their walls. 4,000 years earlier and half a world away, another society was doing it with surgical precision. Number 2. Shimao Foundation Sacrifice Pits, Shaanxi Province, China. On the lowest plateau in northern Shaanxi Province, villagers spent decades assuming the crumbling stone walls near their homes were part of the Great Wall. But then looters started pulling jade out of the rubble. Discs, blades, scepters. Jade that was not native to the area. The nearest source was nearly 1,000 miles away. What archaeologists eventually uncovered was not a stretch of border wall, but a 4,300-year-old fortified city covering more than 400 hectares. The largest known Neolithic settlement in China, crowned by a stepped stone pyramid more than 200 feet tall. Carbon dating placed parts of Shimao at 2300 BC. That is nearly 2,000 years before the oldest section of the Great Wall and 500 years before Chinese civilization was supposed to have begun on the Central Plains. Beneath the city's eastern wall, archaeologists found 80 human skulls, clustered in 6 pits. No skeletons attached, just heads. The 2 pits closest to the east gate, the city's principal entrance, each contained exactly 24 skulls. Not roughly 24, exactly 24. A number that suggests deliberate counting, not battlefield disposal. Li Min, an archaeologist at UCLA, said the scale of ritual violence observed at Shimao was unprecedented in early China. These were foundation sacrifices, people decapitated and buried to consecrate the walls during construction. A 2025 study published in Nature analyzed ancient DNA from 169 individuals at Shimao and overturned a key assumption. Earlier morphological assessments had classified most of the East Gate sacrificial victims as female. The DNA showed that 9 out of 10 were male. 3 individuals previously identified as women from their skeletal features turned out to be men when their genetic profiles were examined. It was a stark demonstration of the limits of bone-based sex identification. Inside the city, a contrasting pattern. Female sacrifices dominated the elite cemeteries. At Hanjigadan, the noble cemetery, 6 of 7 sacrificed individuals were women. At Huanchaco, the ruling class cemetery, 14 of 19 were female. These women were entombed alongside high-status individuals, suggesting their role in ancestor veneration rather than public consecration. 2 systems of ritual killing operating simultaneously, divided by gender and function. There is more buried in the walls than bodies. Intact cypress wooden beams were found inside the stone walls, carbon dated to 2300 BC. A construction method scholars had previously attributed to the Han Dynasty more than 2,000 years later. Archaeologists uncovered 70 relief sculptures carved in stone. Serpents, monsters, half-human beasts that bear an unsettling resemblance to Bronze Age Chinese iconography from centuries later. Shimao was abandoned by approximately 1800 BC. The civilization that built it left no written records. We do not know their name, their language, or what they called their city. Only a fraction of Shimao has been dug. The mainstream interpretation is foundation sacrifice to consecrate defensive walls. But the exclusively male profile of the East Gate victims has led some researchers to propose a different reading. These were not random sacrifices, but trophy heads, defeated enemies from interpolity warfare, embedded in the walls as both spiritual protection and political propaganda. A message to anyone approaching the gate. A more speculative interpretation focuses on the number. 24 skulls per pit. Some have suggested this reflects an astronomical or calendrical system. No consensus exists, but what is clear is that the practice of burying the dead into the foundations of the living did not begin at Shimao. And at a quiet residential municipality in southwest Germany, archaeologists found something far worse than skulls in walls. Number 3, the Herxheim mass cannibalism site, southwest Germany. In 1996, a construction project in the municipality of Herxheim bei Landau hit bone. Locals reported finding human skulls. By the time archaeologists arrived, parts of the site had already been destroyed by the builders. What remained was classified as a rescue dig. Herxheim belongs to the linear pottery culture, known by its German abbreviation LBK, one of Europe's first farming communities. They arrived around 5300 BC and their culture collapsed around 4900 BC. Herxheim dates to that final window, the same era that produced the Talheim death pit and the Schlitz Aspern massacre. But Herxheim is different. Talheim and Schlitz show battlefield violence. Herxheim shows something else. The site contained the scattered, butchered remains of more than 1,000 individuals. Since only half the enclosure has been excavated, the true figure is almost certainly far higher. All of the deposition occurred within the final 50 years of occupation. This was not centuries of gradual accumulation. It was an intensifying practice. A 2006 study first documented the evidence: intentional breakage and cutting of human bones, particularly skulls. The bones had been broken with stone tools in a peri-mortem state, meaning at or very near the time of death. Spongy bone elements like the spinal column, the patella, the sternum were heavily underrepresented. This is the same pattern seen in animal butchery, where spongy bones are consumed or discarded during processing. Preferential chewing marks were found on the small bones of the hands and feet. The bones had been split for marrow extraction. There was evidence of roasting. A detailed 2015 study confirmed what the earlier work had suggested. All 1,000 plus individuals had been butchered and eaten. The excavators wrote that cannibalism for the simple purpose of survival is highly improbable, all the more so as the characteristics of the deposits show a standard, repetitive, and strongly ritualized practice. The remains had been deposited in the ditches within days of death. Body parts were still connected by soft tissue when they were placed in the ground. These people were killed, processed, and consumed at or near Herxheim. Isotope analysis added another dimension. The victims came from diverse, sometimes distant regions. These were not locals eating their own community. The people being consumed were outsiders. Two main hypotheses compete. The first is that Herxheim was a warrior raiding hub. Its inhabitants attacked other LBK communities, captured people, and brought them back for ritual consumption. The second hypothesis is that Herxheim was a major religious center. People from distant areas brought captives or slaves to the site for ritual sacrifice and cannibalism, making it a kind of pilgrimage destination for the macabre. The skulls received special treatment. Many were fashioned into cups or bowls, a type of artifact called Schädelkalotten, found at other European Neolithic sites as well. The LBK collapsed across Central Europe around 4900 BC. No written records survived. The site was sealed under 7,000 years of agricultural soil in what is today a quiet residential area. But while Herxheim's people processed the dead and threw away the remains, another community at almost exactly the same time was doing something arguably stranger. They were keeping the dead underneath the kitchen floor and sleeping on top of them. Number 4. The living room. Dead of Çatalhöyük, Konya, Turkey. On the Konya plain in central Turkey sits one of the world's oldest known cities. Çatalhöyük was occupied from roughly 7100 to 6000 Cal BCE, and at its peak may have housed up to 8,000 people. It had no streets. The houses were built directly against each other in a honeycomb-like aggregate, and you entered your home by climbing down through a hole in the roof using a ladder. There were no doors at ground level, and directly beneath the plaster floors of these houses, under the hearths and the sleeping platforms, and the beds where children grew up, the residents buried their dead. Over 800 human burials have been excavated from beneath domestic floors at Çatalhöyük since the 1990s. Adults were typically placed in a tightly flexed position beneath the northern or eastern platform of the central room. Families continued to live, cook, eat, and sleep directly above decomposing bodies. But the practice went further. Some skulls were deliberately removed from the dead after enough time had passed for the flesh to decay. The skulls were then circulated, modified, and in some cases plastered. The most famous find came in 2004 in Building 42. A plastered skull with mottled facial features decorated with red ochre was found clutched in the upper limbs of an old adult female, more than 50 years old at the time of her death. She was holding it against her chest, as if she were hugging it. The skull had been plastered with fine white marl, the same material used to coat the interior walls of houses. It is the earliest example of skull plastering found anywhere in Anatolia. Pigment analysis revealed a gendered system. Red ochre was the most commonly applied pigment to skeletal remains. Cinnabar was reserved almost exclusively for males. Blue and green pigments appeared only on items associated with females and children. In August of 2025, archaeologists uncovered what they called a House of the Dead, a building where the remains of 20 individuals had been placed beneath a single floor. Some of those individuals were genetically unrelated. This was not a simple family burial. Genetic studies also confirmed that Çatalhöyük society was matrilocal and matrilineal. Households passed from mother to daughter. Evidence of excarnation was found throughout the site. Bodies were exposed, allowed to decompose, and then the bones were gathered and tucked into pits beneath the plastered floors. Wall paintings of bullhorns and vulture imagery surrounded the burial platforms. The mainstream interpretation is ancestor veneration. The dead were kept close to maintain a spiritual connection between the living and their forebears. An alternative reading frames the practice as territorial. In a settlement with no streets and no formal property boundaries, burying the dead under the floor was a property assertion, a claim of household lineage and land ownership. A more speculative theory proposes that the dead served a protective function. Bodies beneath the floor warded off evil or disease. Çatalhöyük was gradually abandoned around 6000 BCE. It was completely unknown until Mellart stumbled on it in 1958. But the tradition of plastering skulls and keeping them beneath house floors was not unique to Çatalhöyük. 1,000 miles to the south and 1,000 years earlier, the people of the oldest city on Earth were doing something hauntingly similar, and the skulls they made are still staring back at us. But first, the story of what happened when America tried to build its first subway. Number 5. Boston's subway charnel pit, Massachusetts, USA. In 1894, the city of Boston began construction on the Tremont Street subway, the first underground transit line in the United States. The route ran along the south side of Boston Common and through the Central Burying Ground, established in 1756. What the engineers did not fully appreciate was that the common itself was the grave. Workers discovered that the entire south side of Boston Common was one massive, unmarked burial ground. Over 7 months of excavation, crews unearthed the remains of between 900 and 1,000 bodies. Under early Puritan rule, the common had served as an execution ground. Murderers, thieves, pirates, Native Americans, military deserters, Quakers, and accused witches were killed on the common and buried in anonymous mass pits with no markers and no records. Later generations added to the city's poor. During outbreaks of disease, the dead from almshouses and public hospitals were deposited in mass graves and covered in quicklime. No ordered burial system existed in Boston until 1810. The press was furious. The Daily Advertiser published editorials denouncing the project. The Boston Transit Commission responded with a statement that reads remarkably poorly by modern standards. The earth is a good disinfectant, they announced, and a burial of more than half a century would destroy any germs of disease that might still linger after death. Separately, near the corner of Boylston and Tremont, workers uncovered the remains of over 900 British soldiers who had perished during the Revolutionary War occupation of Boston. These were reburied in a mass grave marked by a slate memorial tablet. The bodies found across the common included American patriots from the Battle of Bunker Hill and the Boston Tea Party, now mingled with the bones of the British soldiers they had fought. Workers described the experience as working in an infernal hole. Bones tumbled from the walls as tunnels were bored through saturated soil. A major gas explosion during the construction killed several workers. Modern death added to the ancient dead. The Tremont Street subway opened on September 1st, 1897, and was celebrated as an engineering triumph. The mainstream view is that the burials reflect standard colonial-era disposal of marginalized populations. A sharper reading argues that the scale of unmarked burial suggests deliberate erasure. Colonial authorities use mass interment as a tool of social control, denying dignity in death to those they considered dangerous or deviant. A more speculative possibility is that some of the remains predate European colonization entirely. The Commons geography matches the criteria for indigenous burial sites. No systematic archaeological survey of the deeper strata has ever been conducted. Today, over 200,000 riders pass through these stations daily. Most have no idea they are traveling through what was once Boston's largest unmarked mass grave. Number 6. the infant foundations of Zhengzhou, Henan province, China. The Chinese call it Da Xingzhuang. In Japanese, it is hitobashiri, the human pillar. The practice of burying a living person, usually an infant or a child, in the foundation of a building to appease the spirits of the earth. The belief was that moving soil during large-scale construction would destroy the feng shui of the land and anger the ghosts of the unjustly dead. The solution was to bury someone new. The earliest archaeological evidence comes from the Erlitou culture, widely considered the first state-level society in China. At the Dongzhou excavation in Zhengzhou, Henan province, archaeologists found the remains of an infant embedded in the foundation of a city structure. The dating is approximately 1900 to 1500 BC. The Shang dynasty escalated the practice on an industrial scale. Oracle bone inscriptions from Yinshu, the last Shang capital near modern Anyang, record the ritual sacrifice of prisoners specifically for building consecration. The inscriptions are transactional. Should we sacrifice 30 Chang prisoners? At the Qiuwan site, a late Shang sacrificial ground, excavators found skeletons piled upon each other with their heads all turned toward a group of 4 large uncut stones that formed a crude altar. The burials occurred in layers. The lower, earlier layers contained 3 people, 1 skull, and 10 dogs. The upper layers contained 17 people and 2 dogs. Human victims were replacing animal sacrifices over time. The practice survived in folk memory long after it was officially suppressed. During the reign of Chunghe of the Goryeo dynasty in Korea, a rumor spread that he planned to sacrifice dozens of infants for the foundation of a new palace. The capital of Kaesong emptied as the population fled. Modern Zhengzhou has a population of more than 12 million people. It sits directly on top of the Zhengzhou, Shaanxi city. The mainstream interpretation is that foundation sacrifice was a consecration ritual. A political reading argues the practice was about power. Sacrificing Chang prisoners in public construction projects was a demonstration of state dominance over rival peoples. The shift from animal to human sacrifice at Qiuwan reflects not spiritual evolution, but political centralization. Number 7. Jericho's plastered ancestor skulls, Palestinian territories. Jericho. Tel es Sultan, the site of the oldest known urban fortifications in the world, a massive stone wall and a tower dating to approximately 8000 BC. By the pre-pottery Neolithic B period, roughly 8000 to 6000 BC, Jericho was a settled agricultural community where the residents buried their dead beneath the floors of their homes. But the people of Jericho went further. In the 1950s, the British archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon excavated Tel es Sultan. In the pre-pottery Neolithic B level, Kenyon found 7 skulls. Their jawbones had been removed, their cavities had been packed with soil. And over the bare bone, someone had applied layers of fine plaster, molded into individual facial features, and fitted the eye sockets with cowrie shells. These were not generic death masks. The features were specific to individuals. These were portraits. Since Kenyon's work, more than 60 plastered skulls have been found across Levantine and Anatolian sites. Jericho, Ain Ghazal in Jordan, Tel Ramad in Syria, Beisamun, Kfar, Hahoresh, and Yiftahel in Israel. Çatalhöyük in Turkey. The tradition spanned a vast geographic range. The British Museum's Jericho skull underwent a micro-CT scan in 2009. The scan revealed an adult cranium, most likely male, with a broken septum and missing rear molars. But the most remarkable detail was invisible to the naked eye. The scan revealed 9,500-year-old thumbprints pressed into the clay where someone had sealed the hole in the back of the skull. Someone's fingers, pressed into wet clay. Nearly 10,000 years ago. It is described as the oldest portrait in the British Museum's collection. In 2016, a 3-dimensional model was created from the CT data. Alexandra Fletcher of the British Museum said it is as if we did the Neolithic process in reverse. A more precise facial reconstruction was later published by Cicero Morais using computed tomography and statistical projections to produce a photorealistic 3-dimensional image. The man's skull had been tightly bound from early infancy, deliberately changing its shape. But otherwise, Fletcher noted, he could go out shopping in London today and nobody would turn a hair. He is a modern human, just like you or me. Iron oxide was combined with the plaster to give it a skin-like color. Hair and facial features were painted on. Signs of wear on many of the skulls suggest they were handled extensively over time. Carried, displayed, perhaps passed between households. The skulls were typically found in groups beneath house floors, positioned at what excavators describe as important spots within the houses. Kenyon's interpretation, which still dominates, is ancestor worship. Denise Schmant-Besserat at the University of Texas at Austin connected the skull tradition to the Mesopotamian practice of trophy heads. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the severed head of the monster Humbaba becomes a magical charm used to deter evil and cure disease. On this reading, the skulls served an apotropaic function, warding off evil or preventing the return of the dead. No written records of any kind survive from pre-pottery Neolithic B. Jericho. The skull plastering practice gradually declined in later periods. Modern Jericho, a city of roughly 20,000 people, sits directly on top of those layers. The dead have been down there the entire time. But not all buried horrors come from the ancient world. Some were found when Rome tried to build a subway. Number 8. The Praetorian Guard's mass grave under Rome's metro, Italy. Rome has been continuously occupied since 753 BC. The city is layers. When the city decided to build Metro Line C, they knew they would hit something. The A and B lines, built in the 20th century, had deliberately avoided the historic center. Line C was the first attempt to tunnel directly through the archaeological core. Construction began in 2007. Every station on Line C has hit ancient ruins. But the find at the planned Amba Aradam station, near the Colosseum, was different. In 2016, workers hit a 2nd century military barracks 9 meters below street level, 900 square meters, a 100-meter hallway, 39 rooms, black and white mosaic floors, frescoed walls. Rossella Ria of the Italian Culture Ministry called it exceptional. Inside the barracks, a collective grave, 13 adult skeletons, a bronze coin, a bronze bracelet. The dead are believed to be members of the Praetorian Guard, dating to the reign of Hadrian, 117 to 138 AD. At a separate dig nearby, workers found the charred remains of a lavish 3rd century house, destroyed by fire so sudden that the wooden beams had carbonized rather than rotted. Inside the house, the skeleton of a dog, trapped when the burning ceiling fell, perfectly preserved. Gilberto Pagani, a bulldozer operator trained as an archaeological construction worker, described finding glasswork laminated in gold depicting a Roman god. The Amba Aradam station is being designed to incorporate the barracks directly. The mosaics and ruins will be removed, placed in special containers, and then reassembled inside the metro stop in their exact original positions. Francesco Prosperi, Rome's archaeological superintendent, framed the broader vision. Our effort is to transform an apparent hindrance to public service into a great opportunity by giving Rome a subway unique in the world, in which you go underground not just to take a train, but also to take a journey in history. The mainstream interpretation of the mass grave is that the 13 skeletons are Praetorian Guard members who died in a localized catastrophe. An alternative reading questions the identification. The dead may not be Praetorians at all, but auxiliary troops or slaves. A more dramatic theory proposes that the mass grave is evidence of a political purge. Roman historians record multiple Praetorian purges over the centuries. The lack of individual burial markers could indicate damnatio memoriae, the deliberate erasure of identity. Rome has only 2.5 subway lines serving a metropolitan area of more than 4 million people. The tension between heritage and transport is real, and it is not going away. Number 9. The Thessaloniki Metro Woman with 4 gold wreaths, Greece. In 2013, engineers constructing a subway in Thessaloniki cut through a 2,300-year-old Hellenistic grave. Inside was the skeleton of a woman buried with 4 gold wreaths and gold earrings shaped like the heads of dogs. In 2008, another Hellenistic woman adorned with gold wreaths had been discovered during metro construction. Her grave had already been partially destroyed by a sewage pipe driven through it at some unknown earlier date. The entire metro route cut through what turned out to be a vast ancient cemetery district. Hundreds of graves, classical through Roman. At the Venizelos station, archaeologists uncovered a 76-meter section of an ancient Byzantine marble paved road, the Decumanus Maximus, dating to the 6th century AD. The excavation revealed mosaics depicting birds and geometric patterns that show no signs of age despite being buried for 1,500 years. The decision to preserve the ruins sparked intense national debate. Across the Thessaloniki Metro project, more than 300,000 artifacts were recovered, one of the largest archaeological salvage operations in Greek history. The project began in 2006. It was planned for completion in 2012. It partially opened in 2023. 17 years of delays driven largely by archaeology. The gold wreath women of Thessaloniki likely lived in the 3rd century BC. Gold wreaths in Hellenistic burials were typically reserved for royalty, high-ranking officials, or victors in athletic or poetic competitions. Their presence in female burials raises questions about the status of women in Macedonian society that remain unresolved. The mainstream interpretation is that the women were members of the Macedonian aristocracy. An alternative reading proposes they were priestesses or cult officials. The dog-head earrings may connect to a specific cult, perhaps Artemis or Hecate. A more speculative theory suggests the women were victors in their own right. The 4 wreaths could represent multiple victories. The absence of a male companion burial suggests independent status rather than reflected glory from a husband or father. Thessaloniki's metro stations are being designed as combined transport hubs and archaeological exhibitions. Commuters will walk through ruins dating back over 2,300 years on their way to catch a train. In Thessaloniki and Rome, the dead were found because someone wanted to build something new. But on a windswept Swedish island, the dead were not found for 1,500 years, because nobody dared go back. Number 10. Sandby Borg, Sweden's Frozen Massacre. On the island of Öland, off the southeast coast of Sweden, there is a grassy mound surrounded by 18th century stone sheep walls. For centuries, the local villagers thought the crumbling stones were the remains of old livestock enclosures. They were wrong. The oval stone wall encloses approximately 5,000 square meters. It was originally 5 meters tall. It contained 53 houses, and it is the site of one of the most disturbing archaeological discoveries in Scandinavian history. In 2010, a PhD student at Stockholm University conducting geophysical surveys noticed that treasure hunters had recently dug pits around the fort. Professional metal detectorists were brought in. They found 5 separate jewelry caches, silver brooches, bells, gold rings, amber, and glass beads. Each cache had been buried just inside the doorway of a house to the left of the door. Archaeologist Helena Victor of Kalmar County Museum said something terrible must have happened. Right away, we realized they all had died. Excavations began in 2011. Of the fort's 53 houses, only 3 have been fully excavated. Inside those 3, approximately 15 individuals were found. A similar number were accounted for by scattered bones in the streets. The dead span all ages, infants to the elderly. But where sex determinations have been possible, only men have been confirmed. The injuries tell the story. Sharp force and blunt force trauma, inflicted from above and from behind. A 2018 study concluded that the killings were acts of execution rather than a regular battle. In 2014, the skeletal remains of a man aged 50 to 60 and a small child, aged 2 to 5, were found face down in a fireplace. A teenager's skull had been split open, most likely by an axe. Some of the victims had sheep and goat's teeth stuffed in their mouths. Gold rings sized for women's hands were found at the site. But no female skeletons have been confirmed. Victor told Ars Technica that the people of this fort were being shunned, consigned to a humiliation worse than death. The implication is that the women were taken. The bodies were never buried. They were left where they fell. Over 1,500 years, natural soil accumulation covered them in just a few inches of earth. The archaeobotanical evidence is remarkably precise. Lamb bones placed the massacre in spring, and Victor noted that they had found the skeleton of half a herring, perhaps part of a last meal. 2 Roman gold solidi coins were recovered from the site, confirming contact with the Roman Empire. The massacre dates to the late 5th century AD, the migration period, a time of profound political instability across Scandinavia as the Roman Empire disintegrated. Öland's chieftains had accumulated extraordinary wealth during this era. Sandby Borg appears to have been a loser in whatever power struggle tore the island apart. The fort was used as a shelter for only a few months before the attack. The mainstream theory is a local power struggle. A rival chieftain or coalition struck Sandby Borg at night. The attackers knew the fort's layout. They killed systematically. They ignored the jewelry, and they left the site untouched for 1,500 years. No burial, no looting, no resettlement, possibly because a taboo was imposed. An archaeological alternative suggests retribution for mercenary betrayal. The teeth stuffed in mouths may be a humiliation ritual directed at perceived traitors. A third theory connects the massacre to the extreme climate event of 536 AD, when a volcanic winter caused crop failure across Scandinavia. During the migration period in Sweden, cremation was the standard burial rite. Unburned bodies from this era are exceptionally rare. The fact that nobody returned to Sandby Borg to cremate, bury, or even loot the dead for 15 centuries is itself one of the most unsettling aspects of the site. Whatever happened, there was terrible enough to keep people away for 100 generations. Every city is a layer cake. Each generation builds on the rubble and the refuse and the remains of the one before. In Rome, ground level has risen meters since antiquity. In Jericho, 10,000 years of settlement are stacked in a single mound. The dead do not sink. The living rise above them, one floor at a time. Construction is the most common trigger for discovery. Subways, pipelines, garages, foundations. The deeper we dig, the more we find. Some discoveries were accidental. Herxheim was found by a construction crew. Boston's dead were found by subway builders. Others were anticipated but exceeded expectations. Rome's Line C, the Thessaloniki Metro. The pattern holds across millennia and continents. Human settlement gravitates toward the same geographies. Water sources, defensible ground. Trade routes. What was a Neolithic village becomes a Bronze Age city, becomes a Roman garrison, becomes a medieval town, becomes a modern metropolis. Each layer sealed atop the last. None of these stories would read the way they do without modern forensic technology. Ancient DNA analysis at Shimao overturned sex identifications that had stood for years. Stable isotope analysis at Huanchaco Las Llamas proved the sacrificed children were drawn from across the Chimú Empire. Micro-CT scanning made 9,500-year-old thumbprints visible for the first time on the Jericho skull. Taphonomy proved that the butchery at Herxheim occurred at or near the time of death. Cicero Moraes reversed the Neolithic plastering process and turned archaeological data back into a human face. At Sandby Borg, lamb bones dated a massacre to a single season. Each technology adds a layer of meaning to what would otherwise be silent bone. The ethics are not simple. In Boston, the remains included executed Native Americans and the colonial poor, communities whose descendants live in the city today. At Sandby Borg, Helena Victor described the site as difficult heritage, comparing it to Holocaust memorials. Rome chose integration, building ruins into the metro. Athens chose exhibition, turning stations into museums. The question is never whether to dig. It is what happens after. For every site in this video, there is more underground than has been found. At Shimao, only a fraction of the city has been excavated. At Sandby Borg, 50 of 53 houses remain untouched. At Herxheim, the estimated 1,000 plus victims could double when the other half of the enclosure is finally dug. Beneath Zhengzhou and Luoyang, Shang and Erlitou era foundations extend under millions of residents. In Huanchaco, Peru, Verano's words still stand. Every place we put a shovel in, we find a child sacrifice. Beneath Jericho, the deepest layers of Tel es Sultan have never been reached. The technology to read what we find improves every year. Ancient DNA. Isotope analysis, remote sensing, ground-penetrating radar. The question is not whether more horrors lie beneath modern cities. It is whether we will find them before construction destroys them. Every city is an archaeological site that has not been excavated yet. The ground rises because we keep building on top of what came before, including the dead. Some were buried with ceremony. Some were buried with violence. Some were never buried at all. The subways, the foundations, the parks, all of it rests on top of someone else's world. The only difference between an ordinary city and one of the sites in this video is the depth of the dig, and whether anyone has started digging yet.